The rise and fall of Anthony Sargent. Some men rule the streets with fear. Others command respect. But Anthony Sargent, he did both. In Birmingham's notorious Lee Bank, he was a legend. Some saw him as a protector, others as a dangerous figure in the underworld. To the kids on the football pitch, he was Coach Sargent. To the city's criminals, he was the king of Lee Bank. But in the world he lived in, loyalty is fragile, and power never lasts forever. On August 25, 2018, as the sun set over Birmingham, Sargent stood outside his mother's house, completely unaware that his time was running out. A stolen red Mercedes rolled through the streets, carrying men who had spent weeks planning his execution. When the gunshots rang out, it wasn't just the end of a man, it was a message to the entire city. But why was Sargent targeted? Was it jealousy, a grudge, or something even bigger? And who were the ruthless figures behind his murder? Men who walked away like it was just another night in Birmingham's Gangland. This is the story of Anthony Sargent, the man who built a name for himself on both sides of the law, only to have it all come crashing down in a hail of bullets. Long before the bullets ended his reign, Anthony Sargent was a man who seemed larger than life. Born and raised in Lee Bank, Birmingham, he grew up in a neighborhood that was no stranger to struggle. Life here was a constant battle between making ends meet and staying out of trouble. Some lost that battle early, falling into the grip of crime. Others kept their heads down, trying to survive. But Sargent, he learned to walk the fine line between both worlds, and he thrived. Unlike many who rose through the ranks of Birmingham's underworld, Sargent wasn't just another nameless face in the streets. He was a man of presence, someone who could command attention without saying much. His reputation wasn't just built on violence or fear, it was built on influence. People listened when he spoke, whether they were kids on the football pitch or hardened figures in the city's criminal circles. He had a way of bridging two worlds. On one side, he was deeply embedded in his community, known for his dedication to Rickman Rovers, a local Sunday League football team. Young men who could have easily been swallowed by the streets found an escape on the football field. For them, Sargent was more than just a coach. He was a mentor, a father figure, the kind of man who made them believe they could be more than just another statistic. But that wasn't the only life he led. Beyond the cheers of Sunday matches, Sargent carried a very different reputation. In Birmingham's criminal underworld, he wasn't just a respected name, he was a powerful one. He moved with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you have control. His name echoed in both pubs and courtrooms, whispered in conversations that often ended in handshakes or warnings. He wasn't just another street soldier, he was a man who made decisions, a man who held power. For a time, it seemed like Sargent had figured out how to balance both sides of his life. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't loud. He was strategic, calculated. And that's why so many believed he was untouchable. But in a world where reputations are built on loyalty, respect, and power, there is always someone waiting for the right moment to tear it all down. Sargent may have been a king, but in the game he played, no throne lasts forever. The storm was coming. And soon, he would realize that even kings can fall. For years, Anthony Sargent had walked a fine line between respect and fear, balancing his role as a community figure with his deep connections to Birmingham's criminal underworld. In a city where power was fleeting and betrayals were inevitable, Sargent had done what few managed. He survived. But by 2018, the streets of Birmingham were different. The rules had changed. The once dominant gangs, like the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson Crew, were no longer the only players. These old rivalries had splintered into smaller, unpredictable factions, and a new generation of gangsters had emerged, more reckless, more ambitious, and more willing to kill at the first sign of disrespect. Unlike the gangsters of the past, who built their power over decades, these younger criminals didn't wait. They didn't care about the old codes of loyalty or hierarchy. To them, power wasn't inherited, it was taken. And if you wanted to make a name for yourself in Birmingham's underworld, you had to do it in the loudest, most violent way possible. The city had become a powder keg, and one of the names that kept coming up in hushed conversations was Connor and Michael Goodwin. Connor and Michael Goodwin weren't just two young gangsters trying to survive. They were rising stars in Birmingham's criminal scene. Unlike some of their rivals, they weren't just muscle. They were calculating, ruthless, and methodical. Their operation was built around one key skill: stealing high-end cars and making them disappear. They were experts at cloning license plates, making stolen vehicles virtually untraceable. And they weren't just boosting cars for quick cash. These vehicles were used for something far more sinister: organized hits, robberies, and targeted executions. Their efficiency made them dangerous. Police struggled to track them because their movements were carefully planned. They switched cars frequently, ditched phones before jobs, and used stolen vehicles that were burned or abandoned after a hit. They were ghosts, until they wanted to be seen. But even as they built their reputation, they knew there was one obstacle in their way: Anthony Sargent. The streets were filled with whispers. Some claimed Sargent had disrespected the wrong people. Others believed his influence was simply too strong, and the Goodwins wanted to erase the old guard and take over. But there was another possibility, one that was even more dangerous. Birmingham's gang wars had never been just about personal grudges. Control over the streets meant control over money. And money came from the things that powered the underworld: drugs, weapons, stolen goods, and protection rackets. It's possible that Sargent's influence was standing in the way of something bigger. Maybe he was seen as a liability. Maybe he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe, in the Goodwins' eyes, he was simply a message waiting to be sent. Whatever the reason, one thing was certain: Sargent's time was running out. The Goodwin brothers, along with their trusted associates Keenan Anderson and Leon Riley, began planning. They were going to make a move, and it had to be flawless. The plan was simple but effective. Steal high-performance vehicles to use for the hit. Clone the license plates to ensure police couldn't trace them. Acquire firearms, weapons that wouldn't link back to them. Choose the perfect time and place, a moment when Sargent would be most vulnerable. Sargent, despite his reputation, had no idea that the trap was being set. He had spent years avoiding enemies, but this time, he wouldn't even see it coming. The city was about to explode, and the man who had ruled Lee Bank was about to become its next casualty. For weeks, the Goodwin brothers had been watching, waiting, and planning. Taking out Anthony Sargent wasn't just about revenge, it was about sending a message. If they could eliminate one of Birmingham's most respected and feared figures, it would cement their status as the new power in the city's underworld. But killing a man like Sargent wasn't easy. He was no ordinary target. He knew the streets, understood the risks, and always carried himself like someone who expected trouble. He wasn't reckless, and he wasn't the type to get caught off guard. That's why the Goodwins needed to strike at the perfect moment, when he least expected it. The plan was already in motion. The brothers, along with their accomplices Keenan Anderson and Leon Riley, had mapped out every detail. This wasn't going to be a chaotic street shooting. It would be fast, precise, and impossible to trace back to them. Their first step? The getaway vehicles. They stole high-performance cars, carefully selecting ones that could disappear into traffic after the hit. Using their expertise, they cloned the license plates, making it nearly impossible for police to trace the vehicles. Once the job was done, they ditched the cars, leaving behind no evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA. Next, they needed firepower. In the world of organized crime, weapons moved from gang to gang, making them difficult to trace. The gun they acquired had likely been used before, and would be used again. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a tool of the trade. Once the hit was complete, the firearm would disappear, passed along to another crew for another job. Anthony Sargent had routines, and the Goodwin brothers were studying them closely. They knew where he lived. They knew where he liked to hang out. They knew that Sargent, for all his power, wasn't invincible. Then came the perfect opportunity. On the evening of August 25th, 2018, Sargent was at a place he felt safest, outside his mother's home on Rickman Drive, chatting with a friend. No security, no gun, no warning. For the Goodwin brothers, this was the moment they had been waiting for. They loaded up into the stolen red Mercedes, masks on, weapons ready. The streets were quiet, the air thick with tension. As they cruised toward Rickman Drive, Sargent had no idea what was coming. He had spent years running these streets. But on this night, the streets were about to run over him. The night of August 25th, 2018, started like any other in Birmingham. The city's streets were alive with movement, cars passing, people going about their business, unaware that in just a few moments, a calculated execution was about to take place. Anthony Sargent, the man known as the King of Lee Bank, stood outside his mother's home on Rickman Drive. It was a quiet evening, and he was relaxed, talking to a friend. For a man who had lived his life surrounded by danger, this was one of the few places where he let his guard down. But that was his mistake. Just after 9:30 p.m., a red Mercedes, its plates cloned to hide its true identity, rolled toward Rickman Drive. Inside sat Connor and Michael Goodwin, along with Leon Riley and Keenan Anderson, 4 men armed and ready to strike. The car slowed as it approached. The street was calm, the houses dark. No one would hear what was about to happen until it was too late. Then, without warning, the first shot rang out. Sargent had no time to react. The first bullet struck him in the back, tearing through his body. The second shot shattered a nearby window, sending glass spraying into his mother's kitchen. The force of the gunfire sent Sargent collapsing onto the pavement, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. His killers didn't stop there. As Sargent lay bleeding, the car sped off toward a Tesco store nearby, where they chased another man down and opened fire again, barely missing him. It was as if the shooting wasn't just about Sargent. It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge them. Then, just as quickly as they arrived, they were gone. Rickman Drive was in chaos. Neighbors rushed out of their homes. People screamed for help. Phones dialed 999. Paramedics arrived within minutes, finding Sargent still clinging to life. They worked quickly, loading him into the ambulance, racing toward the hospital. For 6 days, Anthony Sargent fought for his life. But the damage was too severe. On August 31, 2018, he was pronounced dead. Most murderers go into hiding after a hit. They lay low, waiting for the heat to die down. But not the Goodwin brothers. Less than 24 hours after gunning Sargent down, Connor Goodwin was out celebrating his birthday. In a pub in Hockley, he laughed, posed for pictures, and partied like nothing had happened. Draped in gold chains and designer tracksuits, he and his crew acted as if they had just won a championship. Because in their minds, they had. They had taken down a legend. They had gotten away with it. And now, Birmingham belonged to them. Or so they thought. Because what they didn't know was that police were already closing in. And soon, their victory would turn into a downfall they never saw coming. The night Anthony Sargent was shot, panic and confusion filled the streets of Rickman Drive. Neighbors stood in shock, staring at his motionless body as paramedics fought to keep him alive. But while the streets mourned, the men responsible for his murder disappeared into the night, convinced they had pulled off the perfect hit. For a moment, it seemed like they were right. The Goodwin brothers and their crew had executed the hit flawlessly. Stolen cars, cloned plates, masks, and gloves. No witnesses could identify them. The gun was gone, and by the next day, they were already back to their normal lives. But they had made one fatal mistake. West Midlands police launched an intense manhunt. At first, the case seemed frustratingly cold. No clear suspects, no direct leads. But detectives knew one thing: the streets talk. And soon, rumors started swirling. Word on the street linked the Goodwin brothers to the hit. Their method of operation, stolen cars, precision attacks, and quick getaways, fit too perfectly with what had happened to Sargent. But rumors weren't enough for an arrest. The police needed proof. That's when they turned to technology. Birmingham is covered in thousands of CCTV cameras, watching every street, every turn, every movement. Detectives started painstakingly analyzing hours of footage, tracking stolen vehicles used that night. And then, they found it. Surveillance footage captured 2 stolen cars moving through Birmingham, heading toward Rickman Drive minutes before the shooting. The same cars were later seen speeding away after the attack, disappearing into the city's dark streets. They were able to trace the cars back to the Goodwin brothers and their crew. Even though the killers had ditched their burner phones, they hadn't been careful enough. Police brought in forensic analysts, who tracked phone signals that pinged off cell towers near the crime scene. When they compared the locations of these phones to the movements of the stolen cars, everything lined up perfectly. One by one, the pieces started falling into place. Connor Goodwin's phone connected to a tower near Rickman Drive at 9:30 p.m., just as the hit was happening. Michael Goodwin, Keenan Anderson, and Leon Riley's phones all followed a similar pattern, placing them in key locations before and after the shooting. This was game over for the killers. The biggest breakthrough came months later. In 2019, police in Derbyshire conducted a routine gang raid. Among the weapons seized was a handgun. It looked like any other gun, worn, scratched, passed from hand to hand in the Underworld. But when forensic experts analyzed the weapon, they made a chilling discovery. This was the gun that killed Anthony Sargent. Through ballistics testing, they matched the gun's unique firing pattern to the bullets that ended Sargent's life. Now, the police had everything they needed: motive, movements, digital footprints, and the murder weapon itself. The walls were closing in on the Goodwin brothers and their crew. The police had built an airtight case, and they knew it was only a matter of time before arrests were made. For months, the killers had walked the streets, thinking they had gotten away with murder. But when the police finally knocked on their doors, there was nowhere left to run. Soon, they would trade their stolen cars and designer tracksuits for handcuffs and prison uniforms. And in the same city where they once ruled the streets, they would now stand before a judge, facing the consequences of their actions. The streets of Birmingham had already judged the Goodwin brothers guilty. But now, It was time for the courts to decide their fate. The trial of Connor and Michael Goodwin, Keenan Anderson, and Leon Riley was one of the most high-profile gangland cases Birmingham had seen in years. It wasn't just about seeking justice for Anthony Sargent. It was about sending a message to the city's underworld. For the police and prosecutors, this was a once-in-a-lifetime case. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming: surveillance footage, phone data, and the murder weapon itself. But there was still one problem. The killers weren't talking. From the moment they were arrested, the Goodwin Brothers and their crew refused to cooperate. No confessions, no deals, no names given. They stuck to the age-old gangland code: never snitch, never talk. During the trial at Birmingham Crown Court, they sat emotionless, staring straight ahead as the prosecution laid out the brutal details of Anthony Sargent's murder. But no amount of silence could erase the evidence. Over 8 weeks, the jury was shown the painstaking investigation that led to the arrests. CCTV footage tracked the stolen cars used in the hit. Phone records placed all 4 men at the exact location of the murder at the exact time. Ballistics reports proved the gun used in the shooting was the same one found in a 2019 gang raid. There was no doubt, this was a cold, calculated execution. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from forensic expert Martin Griffiths, a digital investigator. He explained how the killer's phones left a trail, moving toward Rickman Drive before the hit, and away from it after. The prosecution's final statement was clear and chilling. This was not a random act of violence. This was a targeted assassination. These men acted together, planned together, and killed together. The jury deliberated for days, going over every detail of the case. Then, finally, the verdict was read. Guilty: Connor Goodwin, life in prison, minimum of 32 years. Michael Goodwin, life in prison, minimum of 28 years. Keenan Anderson, life in prison, minimum of 32 years. Leon Riley, life in prison, minimum of 28 years. As the sentences were read out, chaos erupted in the courtroom. The families of the convicted men shouted in anger. Sargent's loved ones wept. Justice had finally been served. The defendants showed no remorse. Some blew kisses to their families. Others smirked, as if even a life sentence couldn't break them. But behind the bravado, one truth was clear. Their time in the streets was over. For Birmingham, this wasn't just another gangland killing. It was a shift in power. The Goodwin Brothers had risen fast, but they had fallen even faster. Their attempt to rule the city ended not in control, but in handcuffs. But even as they were led away, the violence in Birmingham didn't stop. Because in the world of gangs, power never disappears. It just moves to the next man willing to take it. The Goodwin Brothers were behind bars. Their crew had been dismantled, and Anthony Sargent's killers were now serving life sentences. But did that bring peace to the streets of Birmingham? Not even close. If history had proven anything, it was that violence never truly ends, it just shifts. Anthony Sargent's murder wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a much bigger war, one that had been raging for decades between gangs, factions, and rising street crews looking to claim dominance. Even after Sargent's death, Birmingham's underworld didn't go quiet. If anything, his murder was just another chapter in the ongoing bloodshed. Less than a year later, in May 2019, another brutal gang execution shook the city. On May 7, 2019, Dante Mullings, a 23-year-old linked to the streets, was sitting in a car with 2 others on St. Vincent Street West in Ladywood. Out of nowhere, a VW Passat pulled up alongside them. Gunmen opened fire, unloading at least 8 shots into the vehicle. Mullings was hit in the lower back. Despite a desperate attempt to escape, caught on CCTV as he sprinted and hurdled barriers, he collapsed moments later. The other 2 men survived, but Mullings didn't. Police believed this was a revenge hit, part of the same cycle of violence that had taken Sargent's life. The streets of Birmingham continued to run red. For the families of Anthony Sargent and Dante Mullings, justice had been served in court. But outside the courtroom, in the alleys, estates, and back streets of Birmingham, the war continued. The same streets that once belonged to Sargent were now waiting for the next generation of gangsters to step up. Because in the world of gangs, there's only one rule: power is never given, it's taken. And as long as there are young men willing to pick up a gun for respect, for money, for revenge, this cycle of violence will never end. Anthony Sargent was many things: a father, a mentor, a feared figure in the underworld. His name carried weight, and his death sent shockwaves through the city. But in the streets, names are remembered, but lessons are rarely learned. Birmingham's gang wars have claimed countless lives over the years. And long after Sargent's murder, the violence continues. The names change, The faces change, but the streets, they stay the same. Anthony Sargent's story is one of power, reputation, and ultimately, betrayal. He had built a name for himself in both worlds, respected in his community, feared in the underworld. But in the end, none of that mattered. In the streets, there are no legends, only targets waiting for their time to come. The Goodwin Brothers thought taking out the king of Lee Bank would cement their status, but all it did was fast-track their downfall. They killed a man, but in doing so, they signed their own prison sentences. And yet, nothing really changed. The cycle of violence in Birmingham continues, just like it always has. Young men are still fighting, still killing, still chasing a sense of power that never lasts. So the real question isn't who's next. It's when. Because if history has proven anything, it's this. The streets never stay quiet for long.